Your translator is lying. The words were quiet, but they stopped $180 million from moving across the table. Ethan Whitmore's pen hovered less than an inch above the signature line as every face inside the private dining room turned toward the woman standing behind his chair. Naomi Carter still held a crystal water pitcher in one hand. 27 years old. Black. A waitress in a pressed white shirt and black apron. And, until 5 seconds ago, practically invisible. Across the 12-foot walnut table, Klaus Reinhardt slowly lowered his glass. Beside Ethan, Claire Bennett stopped breathing long enough to notice the silence. But Victor Hale, the translator who had spent the evening carrying every German sentence from one side of the table to the other, simply stared at Naomi. "What did you say?" he asked. Naomi placed the pitcher down carefully. No trembling hands. No dramatic gesture. Just glass touching polished wood with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than the rain tapping against the 42nd floor windows. "I said your translation wasn't accurate." Victor gave a short laugh. Not amused. Dismissive. The kind of laugh powerful rooms often gave people they had already decided did not belong in the conversation. Ethan finally lowered his pen. Outside, Manhattan glittered beneath the November rain, headlights crawling along Fifth Avenue hundreds of feet below. Inside, the room smelled of roasted beef, expensive coffee, and the kind of money that made ordinary mistakes extraordinarily expensive. This dinner was supposed to end with a handshake. Whitmore Dynamics had spent 11 months negotiating with Reinhardt Maskinen AG, one of Germany's most respected industrial engineering companies. If Ethan secured the agreement tonight, his company would gain access to a manufacturing network capable of changing its future. If he lost it, competitors would be waiting by morning. That was why Ethan had flown Klaus and his executives to New York. That was why attorneys had spent weeks reviewing every page. And that was why Victor Hale was sitting 3 seats away in a charcoal suit, wearing the calm expression of a man everyone trusted to make two. Languages mean the same thing. Naomi was supposed to refill the water. That was all. 40 minutes earlier, she had entered the room carrying a tray while Ethan discussed quarterly projections and Klaus listened through Victor's translations. Nobody asked Naomi what she thought. Nobody asked whether she understood the conversation. One executive had called her sweetheart without looking up from his phone. Another had moved his empty coffee cup toward the edge of the table without saying a word. Naomi served them anyway. Quietly. Professionally. She heard Klaus speak. She heard Victor answer. And the first time the meaning shifted, she told herself she might have misunderstood. The second time, she knew she hadn't. By the third, something cold settled in her stomach. Victor wasn't struggling with German. He was changing it. Small changes. Careful changes. A condition became a suggestion. A hesitation became approval. Nothing dramatic enough to stop the room. Nothing obvious enough for Ethan to notice. But Naomi noticed. And now, with the final contract open and Ethan's signature seconds away, Klaus said one last sentence in German. Victor listened, nodded, then turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Reinhardt has accepted the revised terms," he said. Ethan smiled and reached for his pen. Naomi looked at Klaus. The German executive wasn't smiling. She looked at Victor. He was. Then she looked at the signature line. 11 months of negotiations were about to be decided by words Klaus Reinhardt had never actually said. Naomi could remain silent and keep her job, or she could speak and become the easiest person in the room to blame. The pen descended. "No, sir." Ethan stopped. Naomi stepped forward. "Your translator is lying." Ethan Whitmore did not answer immediately. Men like Ethan were accustomed to interruptions, but only from people whose names appeared on contracts, office doors, or financial reports. Naomi Carter belonged to none of those categories. 40 minutes earlier, when the private dinner began, Ethan had barely noticed her entering the room. His attention had been fixed on Klaus Reinhardt, the silver-haired German executive seated across from him beneath the warm amber lights of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. At 42, Ethan had built Whitmore Dynamics from a small engineering consultancy into a company valued at more than $900 million, and tonight was supposed to push it into an entirely different league. The agreement with Reinhardt Maskinen AG was worth $180 million over 5 years, but the number alone did not explain the pressure sitting behind Ethan's calm expression. Whitmore Dynamics had developed an industrial monitoring system that could predict mechanical failures before factory equipment stopped working. The technology was promising. The problem was scale. Ethan could design the future, but he could not manufacture it fast enough. Klaus could. Reinhard Maskinen operated facilities across Germany and supplied equipment throughout Europe. Ethan needed that network. Klaus needed Ethan's technology. On paper, the partnership looked inevitable. In person, it was anything but simple. Klaus spoke English, but for negotiations this technical, he preferred German. Precision mattered to him. One misplaced word could turn a guarantee into an intention, an obligation into an option. That made Victor Hale essential. Victor had arrived with polished credentials, 15 years of corporate translation experience, and recommendations from people Ethan trusted. Every sentence crossed the table through him. Klaus spoke. Victor translated. Ethan responded. Victor carried the answer back. For most of the evening, the rhythm seemed flawless. Naomi moved around that rhythm like a shadow. She replaced silverware, poured sparkling water, delivered coffee, and disappeared toward the service door before anyone remembered she had been there. Yet she listened. Not deliberately at first. German simply reached her ears the way an old melody does, familiar before memory has time to explain why. Klaus mentioned production schedules. Victor translated. Naomi's hand paused over a water glass. Something was slightly wrong. Klaus had expressed concern. Victor described it as curiosity. Naomi continued walking. Minutes later, Klaus spoke about intellectual property protections. Victor softened another phrase. Naomi glanced across the table. Klaus looked serious. Ethan looked satisfied. Victor looked comfortable. She told herself there could be reasons. Business translation was not always literal. Meaning sometimes had to bend so conversation could remain natural. She knew that, so she said nothing. Then came another difference. And another. Each one was small enough to excuse by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. Claire Bennett noticed Naomi lingering near the coffee station and gave her a polite nod, perhaps assuming she was waiting for someone to request a refill. Victor noticed too. His eyes met Naomi's for half a second before he turned back toward Klaus. There was no surprise in his expression, only calculation. That was the moment Naomi felt the evening change. She had spent years learning what people sounded like when they searched for the right word. Victor was not searching. He knew exactly what Klaus was saying. And each time he changed it, he did so smoothly enough that nobody who needed him would ever know. Naomi had learned a long time ago that being overlooked could teach you things. People spoke differently when they believed the person carrying their coffee did not matter. They relaxed. They stopped measuring their words. They revealed themselves. Tonight, Victor Hale was revealing more than he realized. Naomi moved toward the far end of the table and collected an untouched dessert plate while Klaus Reinhardt spoke about the proposed manufacturing schedule. His German was measured and precise. Implementation immediately. Victor translated Ethan's response into German, but again, he adjusted the meaning. Klaus frowned. Naomi lowered her eyes before anyone caught her watching. Once could be interpretation. Twice could be carelessness. This was something else. She carried the plate toward the service station, where the muted clink of porcelain gave her a few seconds to think. She could report Victor to the dining manager, but the manager did not speak German. She could approach Claire Bennett, but interrupting a private corporate negotiation could end Naomi's shift before she finished explaining herself. And there was another problem. She was a waitress. Victor was the professional translator. His credentials had put him at that table. Her uniform had placed her beside it. In a disagreement between them, Naomi knew exactly whose voice would sound credible first. Coffee. The word came from one of Ethan's executives without a glance in her direction. Naomi returned with the pot. "Thank you, sweetheart," the man said, sliding his cup toward her while continuing his conversation. Naomi filled it without reacting. Across the table, Victor watched her again. This time his smile disappeared. "We are fine on beverages," he said. His tone remained polite, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. "Leave." Naomi looked at the nearly full glasses. "Of course, sir." She stepped away. Klaus began speaking again. Naomi had almost reached the door when she heard one German phrase that stopped her. Exclusive control. She turned slightly. Klaus was explaining that Reinhard Maskinen would not surrender exclusive control of its proprietary manufacturing process without separate board authorization. Victor listened carefully. Finalize it. She finally understood the danger. If nobody challenged Victor, two companies were about to sign the same document believing they had agreed to two different deals. Claire Bennett looked down at the contract, then across the table at Klaus Reinhardt. Something had changed in his expression. It was not anger. It was confusion. The kind that appears when two people believe they are having the same conversation and suddenly realize they are not. Ethan did not see it. He was already studying the signature page, mentally moving beyond the dinner toward factories, production targets, investor calls, and the announcement he had waited nearly a year to make. Naomi saw everything. She stood near the service station with an empty coffee pot in her hand, listening as Klaus continued in German. His next sentence was even more specific. The manufacturing license could be discussed later, he explained, but only after an independent technical review and separate approval from his board in Munich. Victor translated without hesitation. Mr. Reinhardt says the licensing language is acceptable as written. Naomi stared at him. One sentence. One change. Millions of dollars of difference. Claire tapped the contract with her pen. So there are no additional conditions? Victor turned toward Klaus and asked something in German, but Naomi heard another manipulation. Instead of asking whether that evening returned to her with uncomfortable clarity. Private dining guests were not to be interrupted. Staff members were not to join conversations. Any concern should go through management. Simple rules. Safe rules. Rules written for ordinary dinners. This was no longer an ordinary dinner. Everything all right? Claire asked Ethan. Better than all right, he replied. 11 months, and we finally got there. Victor smiled. Congratulations. Naomi looked at him. He noticed. For the first time, something flickered behind his confidence. He rose slightly and adjusted his jacket. Miss, I believe we are finished with service. Naomi remained still. The table has everything it needs, Victor added. Ethan glanced up, impatient now. Thank you. We will call if we need anything else. Naomi nodded because that was what her job required. She turned toward the door. 3 steps. 4. Behind her, paper moved across polished wood. Claire quietly confirmed the page numbers. Klaus uncapped his pen. Ethan did the same. Naomi reached the door and placed her hand near the brass handle. She could leave. She could tell herself that these men had attorneys, executives, and enough money to protect themselves. She could tell herself it was not her responsibility. Then Klaus spoke one final sentence in German. His voice was calm, almost ceremonial. He said he was prepared to sign because the licensing rights remained subject to future board approval. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Victor translated. Mr. Reinhardt says he is ready to sign the agreement exactly as presented. Ethan lowered his pen toward the paper. Naomi turned around. Wait. Naomi's voice crossed the room before Ethan Whitmore's pen touched the signature line. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. Ethan stopped and looked toward the door, where Naomi stood with one hand still near the brass handle. Klaus Reinhardt raised his eyes from his own copy of the agreement. Claire Bennett slowly set down her pen. Victor Hale was the only person who seemed immediately irritated. Is there a problem with the service? Ethan asked. Naomi could feel every instinct telling her to choose the easy answer. No, sir. Sorry, sir. Have a good evening, sir. Those words would protect her shift. They would protect her paycheck. They would also allow two companies to sign a $180 million agreement based on 2 different versions of the truth. Naomi walked back toward the table. Each step seemed louder than the last against the polished floor. There is a problem, she said. Victor leaned back in his chair. Then I am sure the dining manager can handle it. The problem is not with dinner. Silence settled over the room. Ethan's expression hardened. He had spent 11 months reaching this moment, and patience was becoming expensive. Then what exactly is the problem? Naomi looked at Klaus first, then Claire. Finally, she looked at Victor. What Mr. Reinhardt just said is not what Mr. Hale told you he said. Victor gave a small laugh. You misunderstood. I do not think I did. Miss Carter, Ethan said, reading the name on her uniform for what seemed like the first time. This is a confidential negotiation. I understand. Then you understand why interrupting it is inappropriate. Naomi swallowed. The safest choice was still waiting for her. She could apologize. She could leave. Nobody would blame a waitress for refusing to risk her job over a contract that had nothing to do with her. But Klaus was watching her differently now. Not dismissively. Carefully. Victor turned toward Ethan. She probably heard a few German words and assumed she understood the context. It happens more often than you would think. Naomi's eyes moved to the contract. He said the licensing rights still require separate approval from the Reinhardt board. Claire's face changed. Ethan looked at Victor. Victor did not blink. That is incorrect. Naomi continued. He also said the accelerated production schedule depends on additional inspections during the first 12 months. Claire straightened in her chair. Victor, you told us that requirement had been removed. Because it was. Klaus spoke suddenly in German, his tone sharper now, asking why they were discussing conditions he believed had already been understood. Victor immediately turned toward him, but Naomi spoke before he could translate. She answered Klaus in German. Calmly. Naturally. No hesitation. Klaus froze with his pen still between his fingers. Claire stared at Naomi. Ethan's irritation disappeared, replaced by something far more focused. Victor's face lost its easy confidence. Naomi finished her sentence, then turned back toward Ethan. Mr. Reinhardt believes you understand that both provisions are conditional. You believe he accepted them without conditions. Both of you are about to sign the same document for different reasons. Nobody moved. Rain traced silver lines down the windows behind Klaus. Ethan slowly pushed the contract away from his pen. Victor opened his mouth. Ethan lifted one hand. Not yet. Then he looked at Naomi. Really looked at her. Tell me exactly what he said. Naomi did not look at Victor. She looked directly at Ethan and repeated Klaus Reinhardt's statement in English, slowly enough that every word could settle where it belonged. He said he is prepared to sign tonight because he understands that the manufacturing license remains subject to a separate technical review and approval by his board in Munich. He did not say the license was approved. He said the opposite. Claire Bennett immediately opened her copy of the agreement and turned back several pages. Ethan remained silent. Across the table, Klaus watched Naomi with growing attention. Victor finally leaned forward. That is an overly literal interpretation. Corporate German requires context. Naomi turned toward him. Then give us the context. Victor paused. Excuse me. Explain why you translated a condition as an approval. The room went still again. Victor's expression tightened, but his voice remained polished. Because professional interpretation is about meaning, not individual words. You would understand that if you had training. There it was. The assumption he had been waiting to use. Naomi was wearing an apron. Victor was wearing a tailored suit. He had credentials. She had a name tag. To him, that settled the argument before it began. Ethan looked between them. Victor says you are wrong. Naomi nodded once. Then asked Mr. Reinhardt. Victor gave another dismissive smile. Or better yet, translate it yourself. Claire looked up sharply. Ethan said nothing. Klaus clearly understood enough English to recognize the challenge, even if he did not catch every detail. Naomi turned toward him and began speaking German. Her voice changed only in rhythm, not confidence. She repeated the disputed terms, clarified the difference between conditional authorization and immediate licensing approval, then asked Klaus whether that accurately represented what he intended to communicate. Klaus listened without interrupting. When Naomi finished, he stared at her for a long second. Then he answered in German. Naomi translated. He says yes. That is exactly what he meant. Victor started to speak, but Klaus raised his voice just enough to take control of the conversation. This time he used English. She understood me perfectly. 5 words. That was all it took. Claire slowly closed her contract. Ethan leaned back, his eyes fixed on Victor. The balance inside the room had shifted without anyone leaving their chair. 10 minutes earlier, Victor had controlled every sentence that crossed the table. Now nobody wanted him to translate the next one. Ethan turned to Naomi. How much German do you speak? Enough to know this was not a misunderstanding. That was not my question. Naomi held his gaze. I am fluent. Victor shook his head. Fluent is a generous word. Klaus answered before Naomi could. No. Her German is excellent. The compliment did not make Naomi smile. She had not stepped into the conversation to impress anyone. She had stepped in because the truth was being altered 3 feet away from people preparing to put their names beneath it. Ethan glanced toward Claire. How many discrepancies have we heard tonight? Claire looked at Naomi. Naomi thought about the production schedule, the inspection requirement, the licensing rights, the careful substitutions that had seemed harmless until they formed a pattern. At least 4 that I noticed. Ethan's face changed. 4. Naomi nodded. Possibly more before I entered the room. Victor's composure finally cracked at the edges. This is absurd. You are taking the word of restaurant staff over a certified interpreter. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he pulled the unsigned agreement away from the center of the table. No, he said quietly. I am taking the word of the German executive sitting across from me. Then he looked back at Naomi. Were those 4 mistakes all in our favor? Naomi searched her memory. That was when the pattern became even more troubling. No, she said. And that is exactly what worries me. Claire was already moving through the contract when Naomi answered. Her fingers traveled down the pages, stopping at highlighted clauses, handwritten notes, and revisions that had consumed weeks of negotiations. If the mistakes were not all benefiting us, then what were they doing? Ethan asked. Naomi looked toward Victor, but this time he avoided her eyes. They were creating disagreement, she said. Claire stopped turning pages. Explain. Naomi moved closer to the table. When Mr. Reinhardt expressed concern about the production schedule, Victor made it sound like approval. But earlier, when your team offered flexibility on warranty costs, he translated your offer more aggressively than you stated it. Mr. Reinhardt thought you were demanding concessions. You thought he was refusing reasonable terms. Klaus listened as Naomi summarized the exchange in German. His expression changed immediately. He replied with several quick sentences. Naomi translated. He says that explains why negotiations nearly ended 3 weeks ago. He believed Whitmore Dynamics had suddenly changed its position. Ethan stared at Victor. You told me they changed theirs. Because they did, Victor said. Negotiations are complicated. She is reconstructing conversations from fragments she overheard while serving dinner. Claire opened her laptop. Then reconstruction should be easy to disprove. She searched through archived emails and pulled up the negotiation notes from 3 weeks earlier. Ethan moved beside her. Klaus asked something in German. Naomi answered, and for the first time that evening, communication crossed the table without Victor touching it. Claire found the document. Here. She read Ethan's original. Instruction allowed. Whitmore Dynamics had offered to absorb part of the warranty expense if Reinhardt maintained the proposed production schedule. Klaus shook his head before Claire even finished. Naomi translated his response. He says that offer was never presented to him that way. He was told Whitmore would only absorb those costs if Reinhardt surrendered additional licensing rights. Claire looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Victor. One discrepancy could be a mistake, for could be incompetence. But now they were looking at something with direction. Each altered sentence had pushed the two companies farther apart, then made Victor increasingly necessary to pull them together. Claire, Ethan said, check the intermediary correspondence. Victor's chair shifted. This has gone far enough. Nobody answered him. Claire searched again. She found invoices from Hale International Language Services, then consulting records attached to the negotiation process. Her eyes narrowed. Victor, why was your firm receiving referral payments from Northbridge Strategic Partners? Victor's face remained controlled, but his answer came half a second too late. Northbridge refers international clients to us. That is standard business. Ethan's expression hardened. Northbridge represents Halcyon Industrial. Claire looked up. Everyone at the table knew the name. Halcyon was Whitmore Dynamics' largest American competitor, and it had spent months trying to secure its own European manufacturing partner. Klaus spoke quietly in German. Naomi translated. Mr. Reinhardt says Northbridge approached his company 6 months ago on Halcyon's behalf. Silence returned, heavier than before. Victor stood and gathered his folder. You are turning coincidence into conspiracy because a waitress thinks she heard something. Naomi watched him close the folder. Then she remembered something from 20 minutes earlier. A sentence Victor had translated so casually she had almost forgotten it. Wait, she said. Victor stopped. Naomi looked at Claire. Find the clause about termination penalties. Claire turned to the relevant page. Naomi pointed toward the language. Earlier, Mr. Reinhardt asked whether that penalty applied if either company withdrew before final regulatory approval. Ethan nodded slowly. Victor told us it did. Naomi shook her head. That is not what Mr. Reinhardt asked. Klaus leaned forward as Naomi repeated his original question in German. His answer came immediately. Naomi turned back toward Ethan. He was told the penalty protected both companies. But this version only protects one. Claire read the clause again, and the color drained from her expression. Ethan did not look at Victor anymore. He looked at the unsigned contract. This deal was not being translated, he said quietly. It was being steered. Victor Hale remained standing beside his chair, one hand resting on the folder he had just closed. For the first time that evening, nobody needed him to speak. Ethan Whitmore turned toward Claire Bennett. Save every email, invoice, contract revision, and negotiation note connected to Victor and Northbridge. Send copies to legal tonight. Claire nodded. Already doing it. Victor exhaled slowly. Ethan, you are making a serious accusation based on incomplete information. I have not accused you of anything, Ethan replied. I am stopping the signing until we know exactly what happened. Klaus listened as Naomi translated, then answered in German. His words were controlled, but disappointment sat beneath them. Naomi turned to Ethan. Mr. Reinhardt agrees. He wants an independent review of every translated negotiation record before discussions continue. Ethan nodded. That is reasonable. Victor looked toward Klaus. You cannot seriously trust her interpretation over mine. Klaus answered in English before Naomi could translate. Tonight, I trust what I can verify. The sentence landed harder than anger would have. Claire's laptop chimed. She opened another document. I found something. Ethan moved beside her. It was a payment record from Northbridge Strategic Partners to Victor's language services firm, dated 2 days after the negotiation nearly collapsed 3 weeks earlier. Then another payment appeared from the previous month. Neither proved why the money had been sent, but together with the altered translations, they were enough to stop pretending nothing was wrong. Ethan closed the contract. Victor, this meeting is over for you. Victor looked around the table as though waiting for someone to object. Nobody did. He collected his folder and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced at Naomi. You have no idea what you just involved yourself in. Naomi held his gaze. I know what I heard. The door closed softly behind him. No applause followed. No celebration. Only the strange quiet that comes when certainty disappears and everyone realizes how close they came to trusting the wrong thing. Klaus finally looked at Naomi. Where did you learn German? He asked in English. Naomi hesitated. It was the first question anyone at that table had asked about her that had nothing to do with service. College, she said. Ethan looked surprised. Naomi continued. I studied German and international business at the University of Wisconsin. I spent 1 academic year in Munich through an exchange program. Claire glanced at her uniform, then back at her face. Naomi understood the question before anyone asked it. My mother became ill during my senior year. I came home to help her and finished my degree later, 1 class at a time. After she recovered, I applied for corporate jobs. A lot of interviews. Not many offers. There was no bitterness in her voice. Just fact. Restaurant work paid consistently, so I stayed. Klaus leaned back slowly. And tonight you were carrying coffee while 4 executives depended on someone else to understand my language. Naomi gave a small nod. Ethan looked down at the unsigned agreement. For years, he had built his reputation on identifying value before competitors could see it. New technology, new markets, new companies. Yet the most valuable skill in the room had spent the evening pouring water 6 feet from his chair, and he had never thought to ask her name until she interrupted him. Naomi, Ethan said, carefully this time. You stopped me from signing something I did not understand. She shook her head. I stopped you from signing something both sides understood differently. Klaus smiled faintly. That distinction is why she was right. Ethan looked at Claire. Arrange an independent interpreter for tomorrow. Someone neither company has used before. Then he turned back to Naomi. And if you are willing, I would like you there too. Naomi did not answer immediately. She had spent the evening being treated as though entering the conversation required permission. Now the room was waiting for hers. Naomi looked around the table before answering. Less than an hour earlier, the people in this room had barely noticed when she refilled their glasses. Now a German industrial executive, a Millionaire chief executive officer, and a chief financial officer were waiting for her decision. I will be there, she said, but only as an observer. You still need an independent professional interpreter. Ethan nodded slowly. Agreed. That answer mattered to Naomi. She had not exposed one person's dishonesty to become another person's convenient replacement. Truth needed verification, especially when $180 million depended on it. The next morning, the same private room looked different in daylight. Manhattan stretched beyond the windows beneath a pale November sky. The wine glasses were gone. Coffee, legal pads, laptops, and revised contracts covered the walnut table. An independent interpreter sat between the two companies while Naomi took a seat beside Claire. Not behind her. Beside her. They reviewed the agreement from the first page forward. Clause by clause. Sentence by sentence. By noon, the pattern was impossible to dismiss. Several translations from earlier negotiations had distorted conditions, exaggerated disagreements, or created confusion where the original language had been clear. Whitmore Dynamics turned the records over to its attorneys for formal review. Reinhardt Maskinen did the same. Nobody rushed to conclusions about Victor's motive. They did something more important. They stopped trusting assumptions and started verifying facts. 3 weeks later, Ethan and Klaus returned to the table. This time, every material term existed in both English and German, independently reviewed and approved by both legal teams. The final agreement was smaller than Ethan had originally expected, but cleaner, safer, and understood equally by everyone signing it. Ethan considered that a better deal. After the meeting, he found Naomi near the hotel restaurant preparing for the evening shift. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Naomi set down the stack of menus she was carrying. Ethan handed her a business card. "Whitmore Dynamics is creating an international vendor compliance position. German fluency would help, but that is not why I thought of you." Naomi studied him. "Why did you?" "Because you noticed inconsistencies everyone else accepted. And because when you were challenged, you cared more about being accurate than being impressive." Naomi looked at the card but did not reach for it immediately. "Is this a thank you?" "No," Ethan said. "A thank you would be easier. This is an interview. You would still have to earn the position." A small smile appeared on Naomi's face. "Good." She took the card. 2 months later, Naomi Carter walked into Whitmore Dynamics wearing a navy suit instead of a restaurant uniform. She had interviewed with 4 executives, completed a language assessment, and reviewed a sample international contract before the company offered her the position. She had earned it. That distinction mattered. Ethan understood that now. Money could open doors. Titles could command attention. Credentials could create trust. But none of those things guaranteed character, and none guaranteed truth. Sometimes the person with the least authority in a room was the one paying the closest attention. Sometimes dignity wore a name tag. Sometimes intelligence carried a coffee pot. Naomi had not become valuable on the night Ethan finally noticed her. She had been valuable before she entered that room. Before Klaus heard her German. Before Claire asked for her help. Before Ethan learned her name. The only thing that changed was who was willing to see it. Ethan had spent his career believing power belonged to the person holding the pen. That night, the pen stopped because one woman refused to let silence become agreement. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for a reward. She simply told the truth, and the most powerful people in the room finally listened.